Somewhere between 5 and 10,000 Americans died in the summer of 1988. You have probably never heard about it. There was no wreckage, no sirens on the evening news, no single terrible moment to point a camera at. This disaster arrived the way water leaves a glass left out on a windowsill, slowly, invisibly, and then one day, it's simply gone. It started with rain that didn't fall. The signs were there the previous autumn. Fields across the Corn Belt went into winter already dry, and farmers did what farmers do. They waited on spring. Spring came, the rains didn't. April, May, and June of 1988 became the driest stretch of those 3 months ever recorded across the Midwest and the Northern Plains. Ever. By early summer, more than a third of the continental United States sat under severe drought. At the peak, it was closing on half the country. And that was just the setup. Then the heat arrived. Through June, the thermometer climbed and refused to come down. Records didn't fall one at a time. They fell by the hundreds, across the Midwest, the Plains, the South. Chicago logged 47 days at 90 degrees or higher that year. But here's the part that actually killed people. There was no relief at night. Think about what that means. The sun goes down and nothing changes. The air just sits there, thick, still, motionless, pressing against the windows of apartment buildings with no air conditioning. Day after day, week after week. That's where the real tragedy lived. Not in the cracked fields you've seen in photographs. In upstairs rooms in Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, Memphis, and Philadelphia, where elderly people living alone quietly stopped being able to cope. Heat doesn't kill dramatically. That's the whole problem with it. It kills the old, the poor, and the sick. Indoors, alone, sometimes for days before anyone knocks. When federal researchers went back and counted it all, the direct heat deaths plus the strokes, the heart failures, the bodies that simply couldn't carry the load, the numbers landed between 5,000 and 10,000 Americans. One of the deadliest natural disasters in the history of this country, and almost nobody saw a single body on television. Out on the land, you could watch it happen. Corn came up, stopped, and started dying. Leaves rolling into tight gray-green tubes, the way corn does when it gives up. The national harvest came in roughly 45% below the year before. Cattle ranchers ran out of grass, then ran out of hay, then sold off breeding herds their grandfathers had started. Wells went dry. Families who had barely survived the farm crisis of the 1980s watched their last inch of margin evaporate. And then the Mississippi started disappearing. This is the part that still doesn't feel real. On July 9, 1988, the gauge at Memphis dropped to a record low. Sandbars surfaced in the middle of the channel. 19th century shipwrecks came up out of the mud into daylight after more than 100 years down there. More than 1,000 barges sat stranded, loaded with grain and coal that had nowhere to go. The main artery of American commerce simply stopped working. Downriver, it got stranger. The current grew so weak that a wedge of salt water from the Gulf of Mexico began crawling upstream, toward the drinking water intakes of New Orleans. The Army Corps of Engineers had to build a dam on the bottom of the Mississippi River to hold the ocean back. Let that sit for a second. Meanwhile, out west, the forests had turned into tinder. Fires broke out across the greater Yellowstone region in June and would not stop. Not for crews, not for aircraft, not for anything humans threw at them. More than 25,000 firefighters were committed to it. What finally ended it was snow. By then, roughly 1.2 million acres had burned across the region, about 36% of Yellowstone National Park itself. Nationwide that year, close to 5 million acres. When the bill came due, the damage ran to nearly $40 billion in 1988 money, well over $80 billion today. One of the most expensive disasters this country has ever absorbed. And then something shifted. On June 23, 1988, Washington sitting at 98 degrees, a NASA scientist named James Hansen took a seat in front of a Senate committee and said the warming of the planet was already underway. He put it at 99% certainty that this was not natural variation. It ran on the front page of the New York Times the next morning. And for millions of Americans sweating through that exact summer, that was the moment climate change stopped being a theory in a journal. The response built from there. On August 11, 1988, President Reagan signed the Disaster Assistance Act, nearly $4 billion in emergency relief to farmers, the largest package of its kind at the time. That autumn, the United Nations created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Time magazine set aside its Man of the Year and named the endangered Earth its Planet of the Year instead. But the deeper lesson was uglier. America had no real system for seeing a drought coming, and no system at all for protecting people from heat. So one got built, piece by piece. Congress passed the Global Change Research Act. Crop insurance was rebuilt in 1994, so farmers wouldn't have to wait for Congress to notice them. In 1995, the National Drought Mitigation Center was founded in Nebraska, and by 1999, it was publishing the weekly United States Drought Monitor, the first national map of its kind. The National Drought Policy Act followed in 1998. The National Weather Service developed the excessive heat warning. Cities started opening cooling centers and sending people door to door to check on elderly residents living alone. Every one of those things exists because of that summer. None of it brings back the thousands who died in silence in 1988. Nobody knows most of their names. Nobody ever will. But that summer taught this country something it badly needed to learn, that the deadliest disasters are sometimes the ones that never make a sound. Next time your city issues a heat warning, that warning exists because of them. They were singing. That's the detail survivors come back to. Not the impact, not the fire, the singing. 67 people on a school bus rolling north up Interstate 71 on a Saturday evening in May. Most of them kids, sunburned, exhausted, loud. Coming home from a day at Kings Island Amusement Park in Ohio, the kind of tired that makes teenagers happy. 40 minutes from home, 27 of them would be dead. This day had been planned for months. The youth group at Radcliffe First Assembly of God in Radcliffe, Kentucky, had earned it. A reward trip, chaperones riding along, a converted 1977 Ford school bus the church had bought used from the Meade County School District, yellow paint sprayed over with white. Nothing about that bus looked unusual. And that's the thing you need to hold on to. In 1988, nothing about it was unusual. Every part of what's about to happen was legal. They pulled out of the park around 10:30 at night on May 14th. Just before 11, they were on the interstate south of Carrollton, Kentucky, running in the right lane. Coming the other way, in the same lane, was a pickup truck. Behind the wheel, a 34-year-old man named Larry Mahoney. He'd spent the day drinking. He had gotten onto the interstate through an exit ramp, pointed the wrong direction, and had been driving northbound in the southbound lanes for close to a mile. Other drivers had already swerved around him. Somebody had already called it in. There wasn't time. His blood alcohol was later measured at 0.24%, nearly 2.5 times the legal limit of the era. The truck hit the bus almost head-on, just right of center. And here's where a bad crash turns into one of the worst disasters in American highway history. That bus carried its fuel tank on the outside of the frame, unshielded, bolted on right behind the front door. The impact tore it open. Something lit it. Within seconds, and every single survivor uses that word, seconds, the entire front of the bus was burning. And the fire was already inside. The front door was the only usable exit. The front door was in the middle of the fire. Now picture the inside of that bus. There was a rear emergency door. There was also an aisle built to 1977 standards, narrow, high-back seats packed tight to fit as many children as possible. 67 people, most of them panicking, most of them children. All of them trying to get through a burning aisle to one door at the back. Kids climbed over seat backs. Older teenagers grabbed younger ones by the arms and hauled them through. Some pushed children out and went back in. The bus burned so fast and so completely that when investigators reached it, the seats had been reduced to their metal frames. 27 people died. 24 of them were children. 34 survived, many with burns that meant years of treatment, dozens of surgeries, and scars they carry today. The bus driver, John Pierman, was among the dead. So was Chuck Kidda, the youth minister. The youngest victim was 10 years old. Larry Mahoney walked away from his truck. He survived. He was convicted in 1989 on 27 counts of manslaughter and served just under 11 years. It's still the deadliest crash involving a drunk driver in United States history. It's still the deadliest bus crash this country has ever recorded. And then America did something with it. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated, and the findings they issued in 1989 read less like a report and more like an indictment of an entire generation of school buses. The fuel tank had no protective cage. The emergency exits couldn't handle that many passengers. The interior materials burned fast and threw off thick, disabling smoke. And none of it broke a single rule. That's the part that should make your jaw tighten. The rules were the problem. So the federal government rewrote them. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 301 got teeth. Fuel tanks on school buses now had to sit inside protective steel cages and survive far harsher impact testing. Standard 217 was overhauled. More emergency exits, scale to how many passengers a bus actually carries. Roof hatches, side exits, bigger rear doors. All clearly marked, all required to stay clear. Interior flammability standards were tightened hard. Buses built after 1991 look ordinary from the curb. Underneath, they're a completely different machine. The government handled the steel. The parents handled the rest. Families of the victims went to Frankfurt, then to Washington, and they would not stop. Mothers Against Drunk Driving had been fighting since 1980. Now, they had a case this country physically could not look away from. Through the late 80s and 90s, state after state raised penalties, tightened open container laws, expanded license revocation. Congress passed legislation in 1995, pushing states toward a .08 limit and zero tolerance for drivers under 21. Every state was in line by 2005. Wrong-way ramp countermeasures, bigger signs, reflective markers, redesigned exit geometry became standard engineering. Here's what that added up to. Since 1988, annual drunk driving deaths in this country have fallen by roughly half, while Americans drive far more miles than they did back then. Thousands of people are alive right now who otherwise wouldn't be. They'll never know it. Every year on May 14th, survivors and families gather at a memorial in Radcliffe, Kentucky. Some of them have grandchildren now. Some of them stand in high school auditoriums and show photographs of what fire does to skin, telling kids what 40 minutes from home can cost. They were singing. That's what everyone remembers, and every time a child in this country steps onto a school bus, they step onto something that was built out of what happened to those 27 people on a Saturday night in Kentucky. They paid for it. All of us are still spending it. September 7th, 1988. Firefighters standing on the lawn of the Old Faithful Inn, watching a wall of flame come over the ridge straight at them. A 90-year-old log hotel, 7 stories of dry timber, and a fire moving fast enough to cross open ground in minutes. Nobody in this country had ever seen a fire season like it. And here's the part that gets me. Look at how quietly it started. The winter of 1987 was mild. Spring came in wet. April and May were fine, above normal in places, and park managers went into summer with nothing on the radar. No warnings, no dread. Then in June, the rain just stopped. By July, moisture readings in Yellowstone's dead timber had dropped below kiln-dried lumber. Sit with that a second. The forest was drier than the boards stacked at your local hardware store. The first fires were nothing. Lightning strikes in late May and June, a few acres at a time out in the backcountry, burning themselves out. That was the expectation, and it wasn't naive. Since 1972, the park had run a natural burn policy. Lightning fires in the wilderness were allowed to run because a century of stomping out every spark had left the forest packed with fuel. 15 years of that policy, Around 235 natural fires, most of them burned less than an acre. No crisis, not once. Then July arrived, and nothing went out. Storm after storm rolled through, throwing lightning and almost no rain. On July 21st, with roughly 17,000 acres already burning, park officials scrapped the natural burn policy and ordered everything suppressed. It changed nothing. By then, the fires were making their own weather. Here's what most people still get wrong about that summer. Yellowstone wasn't burning because of a policy. Yellowstone was burning because of wind. Dry cold fronts kept sweeping through with gusts of 60 miles an hour and up. Under those conditions, fire doesn't creep, it runs. Crews watched flames cover 5 to 10 miles in a single afternoon. Embers rode more than a mile ahead of the front, dropping new fires behind the lines faster than anyone could get to them. And the biggest fire of the whole year? Not lightning. July 22nd. A discarded cigarette on Targhee National Forest land west of the park. Crews were on it within hours. It escaped anyway, crossed the park boundary, and became the North Fork Fire, roughly 500,000 acres. But all of that was still the warm-up. August 20th. Firefighters still call it Black Saturday. Winds hit 70 miles an hour. In one day. More acreage burned in the greater Yellowstone area than in every recorded fire in the park's history combined. Roughly 150,000 acres gone between sunrise and dark. Smoke columns went miles into the sky and drifted across the continent. Ash fell on towns hundreds of miles away. By the end of August, Cook City was under threat. Then Silvergate. Then, in early September, the fire turned toward Old Faithful. Which brings us back to that lawn. The evacuation happened on September 7th. Crews had spent days soaking roofs and stripping fuel away from the buildings. When the fire came, embers set 19 small structures alight. Cabins burned. The inn didn't. Sprinklers, a metal roof, some luck, and about 100 people who refused to leave. And the fires? Nobody stopped them. They stopped on September 11th, when it snowed. Final numbers. Roughly 793,000 acres burned inside Yellowstone, about 36% of the park. About 1.2 million acres across the greater Yellowstone area. More than 25,000 firefighters cycled through the season. At the peak, over 9,000 people on the ground at once, plus more than 100 aircraft. The suppression bill? Roughly $120 million. It didn't put out a single major fire. 2 men died. Ed Hutton, a firefighter, killed by a falling tree in Montana on September 11th. Don Kirkendall, a pilot, went down flying support. The animals, and this surprised everyone watching it on television, came through far better than expected. Surveys afterward counted about 269 elk, 9 bison, 6 black bears, a handful of moose and deer. The winter that followed killed vastly more than the fire did. What burned worse that summer wasn't the forest. It was this country's confidence in how it manages public land. Yellowstone was declared dead on the evening news. Politicians called for resignations. And then, the science came in. An interagency review released in 1989 confirmed what ecologists had been saying for decades. Lodgepole pine, the tree that dominates Yellowstone, grows cones sealed shut with resin that only open in extreme heat. Read that again. The forest doesn't survive fire. It needs it. By 1989, seedlings were already up. Today, those burned areas hold some of the healthiest young forest anywhere in the Rockies. But the country didn't just shrug and move on. It rebuilt the entire system. The natural burn program was suspended, then brought back in 1992 with real teeth. No fire runs free during extreme drought. Daily risk review required. Clear thresholds for when to attack. In 1995 came the first unified federal wildland fire management policy across every agency. Prescribed burning expanded hard, and the incident command system, overhauled after Yellowstone exposed how badly agencies coordinated at scale, became the model this country later used for hurricanes and terrorist attacks. Fire behavior forecasting, fuel moisture monitoring, defensible space standards for buildings. All of it traces back to 1988. Drive through Yellowstone today and you'll see it yourself. Bleach standing snags above thick green regrowth, mile after mile after mile. That's not a scar. That's a forest doing exactly what it was built to do, and the price this country paid to finally believe it. 11:53 in the morning, May 4th, 1988. Seismographs at the California Institute of Technology, more than 200 miles away, pick up a shock measuring 3.5. There was no earthquake. A chemical plant in Henderson, Nevada had just come apart. And here's what makes this one different from almost every disaster you've ever heard about. Millions of Americans watched it happen live, from their own front yards. Because the first explosion came 10 minutes before the big one, and people ran outside with their camcorders. Some of them were still filming when the shockwave got to them. So what was actually sitting in that building? PEPCON, the Pacific Engineering and Production Company of Nevada, made ammonium perchlorate. That's the oxidizer in solid rocket fuel. It's the stuff that makes a space shuttle booster burn. PEPCON and one competitor across town made basically all of it for the entire United States. Now, here's where the tragedy actually begins. Because this disaster was set in motion 2.5 years before it happened. January 28, 1986, Challenger breaks apart 73 seconds after launch. The shuttle program is grounded. NASA stops taking deliveries. But PEPCON kept producing. The contracts were still live, and the product started piling up. By May of 1988, somewhere between 4,000 and 4,500 tons of ammonium perchlorate were stockpiled at that plant. Aluminum drums, 55-gallon containers, sitting outside in the Nevada sun. Some in plastic-lined structures, some in an area the workers called the batch house. 4,000 tons of rocket oxidizer. Nobody planned for it to be there. It was there because a shuttle blew up and nobody had anywhere else to put the fuel. The morning of May 4th started with welding. A crew was repairing a fiberglass structure in the dryer building. Investigators later landed on that welding operation as the most likely ignition source, sparks hitting either the fiberglass or spilled product on the floor. And there was one more thing under their feet, a natural gas pipeline running directly beneath the plant, 16 inches across. It gets its turn. The fire started small. Workers grabbed extinguishers. Within a minute or two, they understood they were not going to win this, and the evacuation order went out. Hold on to that decision. It's the whole reason this isn't a story about hundreds of dead. First major explosion, 11:53. Then a second. Then a third, bigger. The final blast, the one on all the videotapes, carried the force of roughly 1 kiloton, comparable to a small nuclear weapon. No radiation, just the punch. The shockwave reached Las Vegas, 10 miles out. Windows shattered across the valley. Doors came off hinges. Ceiling tiles dropped in schools. At McCarran International Airport, glass blew inward. Damage ran out roughly 10 miles in every direction. The mushroom cloud went up thousands of feet. You could see it from downtown. 2 men died. Roy Westerfield, the plant safety officer, Bruce Hawker, a chemist. Around 372 people were injured. Plant workers and civilians cut by flying glass in homes and offices miles away. Now think about how thin the margin was here. It was a Wednesday, close to noon. Right next door sat a marshmallow factory with more than 100 employees. Its walls were blown in. Those workers got out in the minutes between the first fire and the main detonation. Every single one of them lived. Move the timing 5 minutes and you're watching a completely different video. The plant itself wasn't damaged. It was erased. Photographs afterward show a crater and bare desert. That 16-inch gas line underneath ruptured and burned. Total damage, roughly $100 million, and half the national supply of ammonium perchlorate gone in one morning, which delayed the space shuttle's return to flight. Then came the investigations, and the answer was worse than anyone wanted. There were no meaningful federal rules for storing this material in that quantity. None. The plant sat inside a growing residential area. No requirement to notify the neighbors. No requirement to plan for a worst case. No cap on how much you could pile up on site. The fire crews who rolled up that morning had no idea what they were driving into. So the country went and wrote the rules. Nevada moved first, rewrote its storage requirements, and pushed bulk oxidizer production far away from where people live. When ammonium perchlorate manufacturing got rebuilt, it went to a remote site in Iron County, Utah, deliberately isolated. Federally, the fallout fed straight into the Process Safety Management Standard OSHA issued in 1992, the rule that forced plants handling highly hazardous chemicals to document their processes, model the worst case, train their people, and manage change. The EPA's risk management program followed in 1996, requiring facilities to work out what a catastrophic release would do to the neighborhood and file it publicly. Emergency responders finally got the right to know what's inside the building before they arrive. Land use planning around chemical plants changed, and in 1998, the Chemical Safety Board started operating as an independent investigator built for exactly this. Drive through Henderson today, and there's a business park where PEPCON stood, a small memorial to the 2 men who died. The video is still out there. You can watch the fireball climb and hear the person holding the camera realize, about half a second too late, what's coming at them. 2 people died that morning. On paper, it should have been hundreds. The difference was a fire that started just small enough to give everyone a 2-minute head start. That's it. That's the entire margin. "14 people died that morning because of a switch nobody flipped and an alarm that never went off." That's it. That's the whole story. Everything after this is just detail. Delta Airlines Flight 1141, a Boeing 727, Dallas-Fort Worth to Salt Lake City, Wednesday morning at the tail end of August. 108 people on board, 99 passengers, 7 crew, and 2 off-duty airline employees riding the cockpit jump seats. Routine flight, routine airplane, routine crew. And look at that crew. Captain Larry Davis, more than 16,000 hours. First Officer Kerry Kirkland, over 3,000. Flight Engineer Stephen Judd, almost 8,000. These were not rookies. Hold on to that. The airplane pushed back a little after 8 in the morning, and then it sat. DFW was jammed that day, and the taxi out to runway 18 left took roughly 25 minutes. 25 minutes. Remember that number. It matters more than anything else here. Quick thing you need to understand about how a jet gets off the ground. The wings carry surfaces called flaps and slats. They extend out to give the airplane lift at low speed. Without them, a loaded 727 can scream down the runway, hit takeoff speed, and still not be able to fly. It'll lift the nose, leave the ground for a few seconds, and then stop climbing. The flaps and slats on Flight 1141 were never extended. Now, the crew ran the checklist. The cockpit voice recorder caught all of it. But investigators found the thing that would come to define this accident. During those 25 minutes of taxiing, the conversation drifted. Airline politics, dating, careers. The checklist got run in pieces, interrupted, picked back up. The flaps item was called out and answered, and the flaps never moved. 3 experienced pilots, 2 extra airline employees sitting right there. Not one of them caught it. But there was supposed to be a backup. The 727 carried a takeoff warning system, a horn built to go off the second the throttles come up if the airplane isn't ready to fly. It never made a sound. 9:01 in the morning. Engines spool up. The airplane rolls. It hits rotation speed and lifts off. And then, it just stops flying. The wing couldn't make enough lift. It stalled at roughly 20 feet, rolled, and came down beside the runway, hit an antenna, broke apart, burned. 14 people died, 12 at the scene, 2 more later in the hospital. 94 survived. And that number is where this gets almost unbearable, because it came down to seconds and geography. People in the forward section had a chance. The fire moved fast. Survivors described unbuckling, finding a hole where the fuselage had split open, and climbing out through the break into the grass. Some of them went back in for others. DFW's crash crews were on the wreck in under 3 minutes. That's why 94 people went home. The investigation ran a full year. The National Transportation Safety Board issued its findings on September 26, 1989, and they didn't soften it. The crew failed to configure the aircraft for takeoff, and the warning system that should have caught the mistake didn't work. They tested the horn. Why it stayed silent was never nailed down for certain, probably an intermittent electrical fault in a switch inside the system. So both layers failed, human, then machine, on the same morning. But the board didn't stop at blaming 3 pilots, and this is the part that changed the industry. They named the thing underneath it. Cockpit discipline when the workload drops. Long taxi times, easy conversation, checklists run on autopilot, by rote. That crew wasn't lazy. They were doing what crews everywhere were doing. So the regulators went straight at it. The sterile cockpit rule already existed, on the books since 1981. No non-essential talk below 10,000 feet. After Delta 1141, enforcement and training around it got serious. Airlines rewrote procedures so a checklist couldn't be run piecemeal, and so an interrupted checklist had to be started over, not resumed. Crew resource management training, teaching pilots to challenge each other, verify each other, speak up no matter who's got the stripes, expanded hard, and the FAA pushed toward requiring it across the board. Airlines added a physical check, somebody confirming flap position on the gauge, and by actually looking at the wing, not just reading a line aloud. Delta tore up and rebuilt its own training program. And the machines changed too. Takeoff configuration warning systems were redesigned to self-test, so a dead horn tells on itself instead of hiding. Newer aircraft flag configuration problems during the taxi, long before anybody touches the throttles. Here's the hardest part about Delta 1141, and it's why they still teach it in flight schools. Nothing broke. No engine failed, no metal fatigued, no weather rolled in, nobody was drunk, nobody was reckless. 3 professionals with 27,000 hours between them got comfortable during a long taxi and skipped 1 step. 1 switch. 14 people. Every time a modern airliner starts rolling and the crew reads a configuration alert on a screen, instead of hearing nothing at all, that system is there because of a Wednesday morning in Dallas in 1988. 24,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean, the roof of a passenger jet peeled off. Not a window, not a hatch. The roof. 18 feet of the upper fuselage gone in a fraction of a second. And 61 passengers suddenly found themselves sitting in open sky, still strapped into their seats in a 200-mile-an-hour wind. They were 35 minutes from home. Aloha Airlines Flight 243, a Boeing 737-200, running the short hop from Hilo to Honolulu on a Thursday afternoon. 89 passengers, 6 crew. In Hawaii, these flights are basically buses. 20, 30 minutes, several a day. People commuting between islands for work. That airplane had been flying the islands for 19 years. And here's the number that should stop you cold. It had racked up over 89,000 flight cycles. A cycle is 1 takeoff and 1 landing. 1 full pressurization and depressurization. The fuselage swelling slightly and relaxing again, like a balloon. Boeing designed the 737 for 75,000 cycles. That aircraft was second in the entire world for cycles on the type, and it had spent every one of those 19 years breathing salt air. They lifted off from Hilo at 1:25 in the afternoon. Captain Robert Schornsteimer in command, First Officer Madeline Tompkins flying the leg. Normal climb, normal everything. Then they leveled at 24,000 feet. Both pilots heard a sharp crack and felt the airplane lurch. Tompkins said her head snapped back. The cockpit door was simply gone, and when Schornsteimer looked back through the opening, he was looking at blue sky where the ceiling of the first-class cabin should have been. A section of the upper fuselage about 18 feet long, from just behind the cockpit back over the forward cabin, the whole crown of the airplane had torn off and disappeared into the Pacific. Now, think about what that actually meant for the people sitting underneath it. Explosive decompression at that altitude isn't a leak. The air is just gone. Instantly. Everything not tied down goes with it. Bags, papers, blankets, straight out into the slipstream. The temperature drops. The noise is past anything the human ear was built for. And the wind ripping through that cabin is moving at cruise speed. Every passenger was belted in. That is the only reason this story has survivors. One person wasn't. Flight attendant Clarabelle C.B. Lansing, 58 years old, a veteran of the airline, was standing in the aisle near row 5 collecting cups when the roof went. She was swept out. Her body was never recovered. 2 other flight attendants were hurt. One hit by debris and knocked unconscious. The other crawled up and down that aisle on her hands and knees, unable to stand in the wind, checking on passengers and keeping them calm. Up front, the pilots couldn't hear each other, couldn't hear the radios. They were talking in hand signals, and they had no idea what they were flying. Nobody knew whether the fuselage was about to fold in half. They started an emergency descent toward Kahului Airport on Maui, roughly 13 miles out. Then, it got worse. The left engine quit on the way down. Now they're single-engine, structurally compromised, and the airplane wants to roll. Schornsteimer flew it anyway. At about 1:45 in the afternoon, 20 minutes after takeoff, Flight 243 touched down on Maui with its entire front section open to the sky. Kahului was a small airport with no plan for anything remotely like this. Ambulances came in from across the island. Tour vans hauled the injured. 65 people were hurt, 8 of them seriously. 94 of the 95 people on board lived. And then the investigation changed aviation permanently. The National Transportation Safety Board reported on June 14, 1989. The cause? Fatigue cracking along a riveted lap joint in the fuselage skin. Cracks that had been growing for years, quietly linking up with each other, until they all let go at once. The joint's bonding had failed and let moisture in, and Hawaii's salt air did the rest. Boeing had actually issued service bulletins about that exact joint. Inspections had been done, visually, in the dark, out on the ramp. The cracks were too small, and there were too many of them. Nobody was ever going to catch that with their eyes. Here's the uncomfortable part this accident dragged into daylight. The whole industry had been running on one assumption, that a single crack would get found before it turned dangerous. Aloha proved that dozens of tiny cracks could join hands and take out an entire structure in one shot. Engineers gave it a name afterward, multiple site damage. And the world's airline fleet was getting old. Nobody had ever had to think about that before. So they rebuilt the rules. Congress passed the Aviation Safety Research Act in 1988. Then, the Aging Aircraft Safety Act in 1991. The FAA created the National Aging Aircraft Research Program. Airworthiness directives went out across the older Boeing fleet, ordering structural modifications, rivets replaced, joints reinforced, on a hard schedule tied to cycles. Supplemental structural inspection programs became mandatory for high-cycle aircraft. Damage tolerance analysis replaced the old safe life thinking. Non-destructive testing, eddy current, ultrasonic, went from optional to required because the naked eye had just been proven useless. Corrosion prevention and control programs became standard, especially for airplanes living in marine air. And every 737 built since has a different fuselage joint design because of this flight. One more thing worth sitting with. Every passenger survived because every passenger was wearing a seatbelt on a 20-minute island hop. The one person who died was standing up. That's the safety briefing you tune out every single time. That's what it's actually for. 3:37 in the morning. A town of 4,500 people gets thrown out of bed by a blast that registers on seismographs in Baton Rouge, 50 miles away. Windows shattered across 3 parishes, a fireball bright enough to read by, and 7 men who'd gone to work the night before were already dead. Norco, Louisiana sits on the west bank of the Mississippi, about 20 miles upriver from New Orleans. The name comes from the New Orleans Refining Company. That's not a coincidence. The town exists because the refinery exists. Houses sit directly across the street from the fence line. Some families had been there for generations, close enough to hear the plant breathe at night. Shell's Norco refinery was one of the biggest in the country, over 200,000 barrels a day. At the center of what happened was a unit called the Fluid Catalytic Cracking Unit. the cat cracker. It takes heavy oil and breaks it down into gasoline, runs hot, runs under pressure, moves enormous volumes of hydrocarbon vapor through pipe, and in the early hours of May 5th, a section of that pipe let go. An elbow in an 8-inch line, part of the depropanizer system, ruptured. Investigators eventually found why. Corrosion had been eating the pipe wall for years, and nobody knew, because nobody had looked. That line hadn't been inspected in the roughly 11 years since it was installed. 11 years. The wall had worn down to a fraction of its original thickness. Then it opened. What came out was propane vapor, and propane is heavier than air, so it didn't rise and blow away. It sank. It spread along the ground and rolled outward through the unit, filling the space between the structures. Roughly 20,000 pounds of hydrocarbon escaped before anything lit it. Then it found a source. This wasn't a fire that spread. It was a vapor cloud detonation, the whole cloud going off at once. The blast wave flattened equipment across the unit and started fires that would burn for days. Storage tanks caught. The smoke column was visible from downtown New Orleans. 7 workers killed, 42 injured. And then the second disaster started. This one came for the town. Norco was ordered evacuated, 4,500 people leaving in the middle of the night, some with their windows blown out, some with damaged roofs, driving through a neighborhood lit orange by a fire nobody could put out. Over the following days, more than 3,000 people were treated for injuries and complaints tied to the blast and the smoke. Property damage spread across St. Charles, St. John the Baptist, and Jefferson parishes. The total ran into the hundreds of millions. The fires burned about 8 days before the unit was fully secured. But here's what made Norco land differently than a routine industrial accident. This plant wasn't out in the middle of nowhere. The community of Diamond, a historically black neighborhood founded on former plantation land, sat within a few hundred feet of the fence. Those residents had been raising concerns about air quality and safety for years. And in 1973, a pipeline accident in the same area had already killed 2 people, one of them a teenager. 1988 just confirmed what those families had been saying the whole time. They were living inside the blast radius of a facility they had zero say over, and no way to even find out what was sitting on the other side of that fence. What came next rewrote American industrial safety law. The investigators kept hitting the same failure. No systematic mechanical integrity program. Nobody tracking which lines had been inspected, when, or how thin the walls had gotten. Think about what that means in practice. A pipe could sit there corroding for a decade, and the first anyone would learn of it is the moment it opens. Norco, along with the Phillips-Pasadena explosion in Texas the following year, drove the creation of OSHA's Process Safety Management Standard in 1992. It forces facilities handling highly hazardous chemicals to document the process, analyze the hazards, and run a real mechanical integrity program with scheduled inspection and thickness testing of piping. Management of change became mandatory, so modifications get reviewed instead of improvised. The EPA followed with the Risk Management Program in 1996. Model your worst-case release, calculate how far it reaches, and file it publicly. On the community side, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, passed in 1986 and built out through this period, gave neighbors the legal right to know what's behind the fence. It also required local emergency planning committees to write actual evacuation plans instead of figuring it out at 3 in the morning. Shell put in community warning sirens and a direct notification system. Air monitoring stations went up, and the Diamond residents didn't stop. After more than a decade of organizing, Shell agreed in 2002 to buy out the neighborhood, and most of those families relocated. It became one of the defining cases in American environmental justice. Norco's still there, the refinery is still running. But every plant in this country handling hazardous chemicals now has to answer a question nobody was required to answer before that night. What happens to the people across the street when it goes wrong? 7 men paid for that question, and all it took to ask it was 11 years of a pipe nobody checked. 6 men drove toward a pickup truck fire at 4 in the morning. Nobody told them what was parked next to it. 4:11, the first explosion. 4:48, the second one. And by sunrise, the Kansas City Fire Department had lost more men in a single night than at any point in its history. Start with what was actually sitting on that construction site. 87th Street and Highway 71, south side of Kansas City, Missouri. A contractor called Mountain Plains Construction was blasting rock for a new highway project, which means they kept explosives on site. 2 trailers, parked out in an open field, roughly 200 feet apart. Between them, around 25,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, commercial blasting agent. Now, the trailers were marked, there was a security guard, there was even a fence. But here's what nobody in the fire department knew. None of that reached dispatch. The city had no record that made any difference at the moment the alarm came in, so when those men rolled out, they had no idea they were driving toward 12.5 tons of explosives. The night started with vandalism. Around 3:40 in the morning on November 29th, somebody set fire to a pickup truck on the site. It's believed the guard had been driven off or distracted. The truck fire spread to one of the trailers, Pumper 41 out of Station 30, Pumper 30 out of Station 41, 6 firefighters between the 2 rigs, Captain Gerald Halloran, Captain James Kilventon, firefighter Thomas Fry, firefighter Michael Oldham, firefighter Luther Hurd, firefighter Robert McCarnan. They pulled up to a routine call, a vehicle fire in a field. At 4:11 in the morning, the first trailer detonated. The crater was roughly 100 feet across and 8 feet deep. The blast was heard and felt more than 40 miles out. Windows broke across the south side of the city. People woke up convinced an airliner had come down or a bomb had gone off downtown. All 6 firefighters were killed instantly. There was almost nothing left to recover. And then, 37 minutes later, at 4:48, the second trailer went. That's the detail that makes this one sit in your chest, because the second explosion is what would have killed everyone who came running to help. And they were coming. More companies had already been dispatched toward that scene when the first blast hit. Command held them back. Nobody went into that field between 4:11 and 4:48. That call, made in the dark, in total confusion, with 6 men already gone, is the only reason the number is 6 instead of 30. The investigation dragged on for years and turned into one of the most contested arson cases in American history. Federal investigators concluded the fire was set deliberately. In 1997, 5 people from a nearby neighborhood, the Marlboro 5, were convicted on federal charges and sentenced to life without parole. The case rested largely on witness testimony, and it has been challenged ever since. Appeals, documentaries, journalists, legal advocates, decade after decade. Some of the defendants have died in prison. But here's what nobody disputes: why 6 firefighters died. They died because nobody told them. That's the failure. And the fire service went straight at it. The fastest change was pre-incident planning and hazard notification. Departments started building hazard databases wired directly into dispatch, so when an address comes up, the dispatcher tells the crew what's stored there before the rig leaves the house. Kansas City rebuilt its system. Departments across the country followed. Explosive storage rules got tightened hard. Federal regulations under the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, magazine construction, distance from roadways, security, site notification were strengthened, and enforcement got teeth. Explosives on a construction site now come with mandatory reporting to the local fire authority. What's there, how much, exactly where. Training changed too. The exclusion zone became doctrine. A fire involving explosives isn't a fire you attack, it's a fire you back away from and let burn. Firefighters are now trained that the correct move is to withdraw and protect exposures, not advance. And that 37-minute gap became its own lesson for fire and law enforcement both. Assume there's a second device. Do not converge on a blast site. That thinking now shapes how this country responds to bombings and industrial explosions everywhere. The memorial stands today near where those trailers sat. 6 names on it. Every November 29th, the department gathers there. So next time you hear a dispatcher read a hazard warning over the radio before a crew arrives anywhere, Know where that came from? It came from 6 men in Missouri who drove toward a truck fire at 4 in the morning and were never told what was parked beside it. "1:10 in the morning, late November. A tornado carrying winds over 200 miles an hour walks into a sleeping American city. Nobody heard it coming. Nobody was even watching for it. Wrong month, wrong hour, wrong part of the country. By the time it left, 4 people were dead, roughly 157 were injured, and a stretch of North Carolina's capital had been erased. You have to understand why this one caught everybody flat. Tornadoes, in the American imagination, belong to spring and to the plains. Oklahoma in April, Kansas in May. Broad daylight, big sky, a funnel you can watch coming for 10 full minutes. This was the end of November, in North Carolina, at 1 in the morning. The setup was a powerful low-pressure system driving up from the Gulf, dragging warm, unstable air across the Carolinas ahead of a cold front. A November storm behaving like a spring one. It threw off a whole family of tornadoes across the state that night. The one that mattered touched down in Chatham County around 12:50 in the morning. It tracked northeast for roughly 80 miles, and it stayed on the ground for most of it. Around 1:10, it came into northwest Raleigh. The National Weather Service later rated it an F4 on the Fujita scale, second highest category there is. Winds in the range of 207 to 260 miles an hour. Well-built houses leveled, cars thrown, structures swept off their foundations. Here's what it hit, in order. The Kmart Shopping Center on Old Wake Forest Road, destroyed. The Hilltop Home, a residential facility for children with severe disabilities, struck. Apartment complexes along the path torn open. Warehouses, offices, a mobile home community. And then it got into the neighborhoods. 1 in the morning, late November, every family in bed. Now put yourself inside one of those houses. There's no siren, nothing on the television, because the television is off and you're asleep. No visual. It's pitch black outside. The only warning most people got was sound, a roar building out of nowhere, and then maybe 8 seconds to do something about it. 8 seconds. 4 people were killed. 2 of them in a mobile home park. Roughly 157 were hurt. Some of what happened that night still doesn't add up. People pulled out of rubble with their homes gone entirely around them. Children carried out of collapsed structures. At the Hilltop Home, staff moved residents to safer areas as the building came apart around them, and the deaths that should have happened there didn't. Damage across the outbreak ran into the tens of millions. In Raleigh alone, more than 100 homes and businesses were destroyed or heavily damaged. But here's the part that changed everything afterward. The National Weather Service was working with 1950s technology, the WSR-57 radar. It could show you where rain was falling. That's it. It could not tell you what the air inside a storm was doing. Rotation was basically invisible, unless it produced a hook-shaped echo big enough and clean enough for a human to spot on a scope. Which means tornado warnings in 1988 were mostly issued after somebody saw a funnel with their own eyes. At 1 in the morning, in November, nobody sees anything. And the warning system on the ground was just as thin. Raleigh had limited outdoor sirens. There was no way at all to push an alert into a house where people were sleeping. NOAA weather radio existed, but almost nobody owned one, and fewer still had the tone alert feature that would actually wake you up. So the country rebuilt the whole thing. The NEXRAD program, Doppler radar, the WSR-88D, was already in development, and nights like Raleigh accelerated its rollout through the early 90s. And Doppler changes the game completely, because Doppler sees motion. It picks up rotation inside a storm before a funnel ever touches the ground, day or night, visible or not. Average tornado warning lead time in this country went from a few minutes to roughly 13. The National Weather Service modernization that followed rebuilt the entire forecast office network and put trained warning meteorologists closer to the communities they cover. NOAA weather radio with tone alert got pushed hard into homes, schools, and nursing facilities. specifically because of overnight events. Raleigh and towns across the southeast expanded siren coverage. And the real answer came later. The emergency alert system replaced the old broadcast setup in 1997. Wireless emergency alerts launched in 2012, which is why your phone screams at you in the middle of the night now. The Storm Prediction Center also got sharper about cool season and overnight storms. Research since has confirmed why that matters. A tornado at night is more than twice as likely to kill you as the exact same tornado in daylight. That statistic exists because of nights like this one. Drive through northwest Raleigh today and you won't find a scar. It's been rebuilt for decades. But every time your phone lights up at 2 in the morning with a warning for the county you're sleeping in, that's the system this country built after a November night when 4 people never got one. "5:02 in the evening, second day of the year. A steel tank 4 stories tall comes apart without warning and dumps nearly 4 million gallons of diesel fuel into the middle of Pennsylvania. Within days, about 1 million Americans across 3 states had no drinking water. And here's the detail that still gets me. That tank was brand new at the site. It had been filled for the very first time that day. Ashland Oil ran a terminal at Florida, Pennsylvania in Jeffersonboro, 23 miles upriver from Pittsburgh, sitting right on the bank of the Monongahela. The tank itself? Old steel, taken apart at a facility in Cleveland, hauled to Pennsylvania, and put back together at Florida. 40 years old, reassembled on a new foundation. On January 2nd, crews filled it with diesel for the first time. At 5:02 in the evening, as it came up toward capacity, it failed. Not a crack, not a leaking seam. The structure came apart. 3.9 million gallons, gone at once. A wave of diesel surged across the terminal with enough force to go straight over the top of the containment dike. The dike built specifically to hold exactly this kind of failure. Some poured into a storm drain. Some went right over open ground. Within minutes, diesel was in the Monongahela, roughly 750,000 gallons of it. Now factor in the calendar. This is January in Pennsylvania. The river's cold, running fast on winter flow, partly covered in ice. Cold water slows evaporation. Ice makes containment booms close to useless. The crews working that spill were fighting the weather as hard as they were fighting the oil. And the slick was moving downstream toward Pittsburgh, where the Monongahela meets the Allegheny and becomes the Ohio. That's the moment this stopped being an industrial accident. Water intakes along the Monongahela and the Ohio serve entire cities. Operators started shutting them down as the slick came at them. Pennsylvania first, then West Virginia, then Ohio. A chain of towns pulling their intakes offline, one after another, with nobody able to say how long the water would stay unusable. At the peak, roughly 1 million people across 3 states cut off from their drinking water. Sit with what that means in the first week of January. Schools closed, hospitals on emergency supply, the National Guard trucking water in, restaurants shut, people melting snow in their kitchens, bottled water gone from the shelves within hours, and price gouging became its own scandal on top of everything else. The slick kept going, hundreds of miles down the Ohio over the following weeks, past Wheeling, past Steubenville, toward Cincinnati and Louisville. Cities downriver at least got days of warning to prepare. That was the one mercy in the whole thing. The environmental damage was brutal. Wildlife killed along the banks, waterfowl coated, fish kills reported down the affected stretch. The aquatic system took years to come back. Then the investigators went looking for why. And what they found is almost hard to believe. That tank was rebuilt from 40-year-old steel with inadequate testing of the welds. Standard practice for a new tank is a hydrostatic test. You fill it with water first, because water is cheap, and if it fails, you've spilled something harmless. That full test was never performed. The seams got checked by a much less rigorous method instead. So you've got decades-old steel now sitting in freezing January temperatures, which makes it brittle. A flaw in a weld spread, and the tank tore open. There's more. Ashland had gotten the permit for that tank without a complete and proper filing, and local authorities had limited ability to verify what was actually being built. And the containment dike, the last line of defense, designed to hold a full tank release, got overtopped by the surge and had a drain that let product escape anyway. Every single layer failed. What followed rewrote American oil storage and spill law. Pennsylvania passed the Storage Tank and Spill Prevention Act in 1989, registration, inspection, and certification for above-ground tanks with actual state oversight behind it. Federally, this spill fed straight into the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. That law came after the Exxon Valdez ran aground in March of 1989, but it was shaped by both events. It established federal spill liability, required facility response plans, and built the framework for coordinated cleanup. The EPA's Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure Rule got tightened, harder requirements on secondary containment, integrity testing, inspection schedules. Industry standards for tank construction and reconstruction changed too. Hydrostatic testing became non-negotiable for rebuilt tanks, and brittle fracture in older steel in cold climates got written into the standards. On the water side, utilities along the big rivers built early warning networks. The Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission system that tracks contaminants moving downstream and buys intake operators the time to close before it arrives. That system exists because of January 1988. The Florif terminal is gone now. The riverbank is quiet. But every above-ground fuel tank in this country now has to prove it can hold what you're about to put in it, before you put it in. That's the whole lesson. One tank. Filled once. 1 million people without water.